step
Awesome.
aside.
Please just pop something in the chat. I'm not so good at seeing your faces when the slides are up, so Andrew will keep an eye on the chat
Yep.
for us. Um, so as I said, my background is in nursing. I also am the outreach director of Edinburgh Community Yoga. So we're a not-for-profit social enterprise that exists to offer trauma-informed yoga programming in communities in Edinburgh and around. So we work in Edinburgh, the Lothians and Fife, where people might not traditionally access yoga or wellbeing practices. And for a long time, I considered my roles in nursing and my role in yoga to be quite different, but I've really come to see that they are one and the same. And the truth is that the work of Edinburgh Community Yoga, so I run the organisation with my colleague Laura Wilson, both of us came from health and social care backgrounds, and both of us recognised the enormous inequality in the ability to access wellbeing in Scotland. I worked as a nurse in maximum security prisons in Kilmarnock with men who were almost always traumatized, who were incarcerated, who I spent all of my day, all day, every day on a 12-hour shift, giving out methadone and diazepam and watching while prison officers kicked open prison doors, shouted at people to get out of bed, and I handed over their drugs. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. But that experience really made it clear to me that we needed a different way, and we needed to think about ways that we could meet people with unconditional positive regard and offer practices that support wellness instead of our current system. And so health inequality is really the motivation for what we do. We work with yoga in order to do that in the best way that we can. And my nursing experience and my own experience of the benefit of yoga is really what got us to the point of running this organisation. Our vision is that we work with ideas of respect, compassion, and unconditional positive regard. We believe in social justice, health equity, and we are trying to work towards an inclusive world where everybody has the opportunity to access and be empowered by movement and breath work, which are two of the core components of yoga. How we do that, we work as a not-for-profit social enterprise. We essentially take trauma-informed yoga programming to meet people where they are in the communities that they live in, and offer yoga programs that are accessible, that are mostly free at the point of service, and that offer opportunity for people to build and learn on their journey as they go along, and learn more about the practice of yoga. We were founded in 2000 and, well, really the work began in 2011. We were sort of constituted 2013. And we're now into our sort of 11th year of full work. As I said earlier, health inequality was really what drives, or is really what drives a lot of our passion and our work. And what we know is that, some of you might be familiar with these statistics, I'm also aware that some of you might not be in Scotland, but men born in Scotland in the poorest areas, the areas of most socioeconomic deprivation, can expect 23 years fewer in good health than those born in the wealthiest areas of Scotland. And that gap for women is 24 years. And for me, that statistic is even more important than the gap in life expectancy, which sits about 10 and 13 years respectively. But really, what we should be working towards is that people can live as long as they can in good health. And that gap is really significant in Scotland, so 23 and 24 years fewer in good health. You might know that Scotland has the lowest life expectancy in the whole of Western Europe, and that people in the most deprived areas of Scotland are 18 times more likely to have a drug-related death than those in the least deprived areas of Scotland. And so that just highlights the picture of health inequality. And the numbers have got a little bit better this year, but I think it's really important to say that they are still worse than they were pre-COVID. And given the current sort of political and economic situation, I don't at the moment feel much hope as to how much improvement we're going to see in these numbers. The barriers, and this is a really important point. So often we see people talking about making yoga, and I'm a yoga teacher, so my context here is talking about yoga, but I know that lots of you will be sort of offered different types of movement. Well-being, yoga, gym work, a lot of that has been capitalized. The wellness industry means that there is often quite a high financial cost attached to accessing these kind of practices. And what we recognise is that the barriers to accessing yoga in particular aren't just financial. And therefore, it's not enough for what we see a lot of is yoga studios slapping signage on their studios or their website saying yoga for all, accessible and inclusive yoga. And what we know is that the barriers aren't just financial. So it's not just about making classes cheap or having community-based donation classes. It's about recognising the sort of systemic social injustice that exists that exclude people from wellbeing spaces. Poverty is a big one. People feeling unwelcome in wellness spaces, feeling like they don't belong, feeling that the practices like yoga are just not accessible for them, whether it's a geographical location issue or whether it's more of a sort of issue of feeling that the way that those practices are presented make them something that, in inverted commas, is not for them. And so alongside that, we also recognise that in the areas of most socioeconomic deprivation in Scotland, and particularly in the prison population that I talked about earlier on, are where we tend to see the highest number of adverse childhood events, the highest level of challenge for people to be mentally and physically well, and places where people's self-esteem and confidence often means that stepping in to places like yoga studios is challenging. So Edinburgh Community Yoga as a social enterprise, our model should be that we depend on income generated from workplace wellbeing programmes, from CPD and teacher training, and from public classes, supports our work in the community and outreach. We work in a really wide variety of, I've just noticed that psychiatric spelled wrong on that slide, it's terrible. We work in a really wide variety of outreach settings. We work in prisons, we work in psychiatric hospitals, we work extensively with addiction recovery services in Edinburgh and Lothian. And we work in partnership with third sector organisations to take yoga to the places where people are and make it an accessible point of practice that they can have the opportunity to practice yoga in community. More recently, we're working with community-based social prescribing, where people can be referred by their GP, by local addiction workers, by mental health nurses into our community-based projects. And that social prescribing model is one that we are growing at the moment. I am in the middle of doing a research project at the University of Edinburgh doing what's called a realist evaluation, looking really at how these programmes of social prescription work. So what are the mechanisms in which trauma-informed yoga and social prescription work? Who do they work for? How do they work? And I'm more than happy to talk more about that at the end if anybody's particularly interested. But as I say, the model is really the income generated should support our outreach programmes with a little bit of grant funding and fundraising going alongside. The reality is, and I'm really sorry to be negative or sound down in the dumps of it, but the reality is that we are and have been since COVID operating as a charity. We are completely dependent on grant funding, and that grant funding is getting harder and harder for us to secure. And that is because of our overarching political and economic situation, meaning that more and more people in society can't meet their basic needs around food and heating homes and so on. And so, rightly so, funding streams are being directed to those sort of areas. My real worry is that that is a tragedy for the communities that we work with. And, you know, it's not just our organisation who's struggling. We're seeing that. I was talking to somebody at the lottery recently who said that the third sector is a scorched landscape, and so much good grassroots work that is really essential in terms of community support is just not able to continue because of a lack of funding. So I'm not going to sort of sugarcoat the fact that the landscape at the moment in this kind of work is really challenging, but I do believe that together there are ways that we can continue to do this work. Our theory of change. So this is a little graphic that was designed just to outline what our aims and goals are with the organisation. So we offer inclusive and accessible classes in a variety of different settings in the community. I've discussed that already. One of the really important parts of our work is that we support students from our outreach programmes to be able to go on and do further training in yoga. So we have 3 teachers on our teaching team at the moment who came from community outreach programmes, who now teach programmes for us out in their own communities. And we've also got a peer support worker who works for us who came through the same route. And that's part of diversifying the sort of demographic of yoga teachers. Lots of you might know that yoga teachers tend to be a fairly homogenous group of fairly flexible middle-class white women. And part of our work is really about supporting people to be able to develop the skills that they need to go back into their own communities and teach. That's with the caveat, and it's a challenging conversation, and I'm happy to have it, that we all know that making money as a yoga teacher is a really big challenge, and so we're not setting people up for sustainable employability. But we do know that the skills and the confidence that is developed as a result of doing this work has supported people to go out and seek employment elsewhere. This is just a slightly more complicated version of our theory of change. If anybody's particularly interested in looking at it, you'll get the recording afterwards, and I'm happy to send the slides on to anybody who wants it. But essentially, this is just a sort of different way of explaining our theory of change and model of working. The evaluation themes that we see are around community, empowerment, and mental and physical well-being. And I think it's really important to say yoga is the practice that we work with. It's the one that we have found useful in our own lives. And it's what our organisation is set up to do. But the power of community is really what is key. And in Edinburgh Community Yoga, the relationships that are made between students are one of the most important outcomes of the work that we do. The sense of empowerment that happens within the communities that we work in is some of the most important work that we do. And obviously, for any of you who practice yoga or know anything about yoga, we know that there are mental and physical health benefits that also come through practicing yoga. And I would say that exactly the same thing is true of work around movement, around exercise, and around nature-based sort of interventions. Here's a little quote from one of our early women's projects. I never thought that yoga was for me. I just thought it was for posh, bendy people. I would never walk into a yoga studio. I wouldn't even know what to do. I never thought I would be allowed to go to yoga until I started practicing with ECY, which is Edinburgh Community Yoga, through the Women's Project. Now I know that this is my yoga practice and I can do it. It's not for anyone else to tell me. And I would love to say that people's sense of yoga spaces not being for them was an internal lack of confidence. That's partly that, but it's also true. And one of the first outreach students that we supported to attend local yoga classes in a yoga studio on their request, somebody in early addiction recovery, when they turned up at a yoga studio to do the class that we'd supported them on, they weren't actually allowed to go downstairs until the yoga studio manager had authorised it. And I know that that is because of the way that that person presented in terms of how they spoke, how they conducted themselves. And what's really important to remember is that for people who have spent their whole life feeling marginalised and feeling that they don't belong in spaces, when that is then reinforced, it can be really, really harmful. And we did a lot of learning from that. And I guess it's just important to highlight that often the sense of exclusion is real and not just felt. So to move on a little bit to think about trauma-informed practice, does anybody have any questions just before I move on about the work that we do or the organisation? I just want to sort of give you a little bit of a brief background. My own teaching practice has mostly been with women with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I've worked extensively with the self-harm service and teaching yoga to women in prisons. And I now run a chair yoga class on social prescription in Methil and Fife, which is an area of fairly significant socioeconomic deprivation in Fife, just down the road from us. Is there anything that anybody wants to ask or anything popping into the chat so far?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. We've got some questions about theory of change, but I think we can save that for after the talk. So I think you can continue on.
Okay, perfect. So the first thing that I want to say, and I'm really sorry, I normally would say at the beginning of this that some of what I'm about to talk about in terms of trauma is not that cheerful. And if for any reason today is not your day for listening to this stuff, please just feel free to look after yourself. You can duck out for a bit. You can switch your camera off if you need to. But one of the first things that I wanted to say was that when we think about working in a trauma-informed way, it's really working in a way that is understanding of people. And whatever environment you work in, it's super, super, super important that we don't come to a place where we think about the traumatized people over there in the corner and what they need being treated differently to, in inverted commas, the rest of us, because all of us experience trauma and there are traumatized people in all of our spaces. In the work that we do at Edinburgh Community Yoga, we know that they're because we are specifically working in partnership with third sector organisations, specifically working in areas where we are actively working with people who have experienced trauma. We work with a very, very specific trauma-informed approach. But I think one of my key sort of desires is that everybody who works in movement-based spaces can bring some principles of trauma-informed practice into their regular teaching spaces because it's important. So when we think about what trauma is, and to be clear, we're talking about psychological trauma. So the American Mental Health and Substance Use crew define trauma as an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on the functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being of an individual. Danielle Rosson, she wrote a really good book that I will put on the reading list at the end, but she wrote a really good book about trauma and resilience and the practice of yoga. And she said that we need to remember that stress and trauma responses are biological responses that serve important and potentially life-saving functions. We have many physiological adaptations to stress and trauma, and these adaptations have allowed us to escape danger. And what that is really saying is that often when we see the way that trauma presents itself after the traumatic event with PTSD and CPTSD, people often feel like there's something wrong with them. But really, when we talk about that physiological response to trauma, we're often talking about a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And I think that's helpful to remember. For anybody who's not sure, so CPTSD and developmental trauma, really what we're talking about when we talk about trauma that has occurred in the context of interpersonal relationships repeatedly over time. So that is to differentiate it from single event post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the type of thing that happens after, for example, a car crash or a one-off attack, for example. Developmental trauma tends to be what's discussed in terms of childhood trauma. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a version of developmental trauma, or sort of includes developmental trauma, but also could be repeated traumatic events in adulthood. But the key thing to take away there is the work of Edinburgh Community Yoga is mostly working with people with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that CPTSD always exists in the context of interpersonal trauma. It's interrelational, and it's always about disempowerment. Bessel van der Kolk, and I've got his book here. I don't actually know if you can see me with this. I think you probably can in a little corner, but this book here, some of you might have read. To my great sadness, there was a bit of an uncovering of power abuse by Bessel van der Kolk. So I share this book with a little bit of sadness, but the neuroscience that is shared in this book about the understanding of the body and how it responds to trauma is really important, and it's what a lot of the work in trauma-informed practice is built on. And he describes complex post-traumatic stress disorder as this vast system of internal disorganization. And certainly in the work that I've done over the years in trauma-informed yoga practices with people with CPTSD, you see that vast system of internal disorganization play out. Some of the diagnostic criteria, I've stuck them on there, but severe and pervasive problems in affect regulation, persistent beliefs about oneself as diminished, defeated, or worthless, accompanied by deep and pervasive feelings of shame, guilt, and failure related to the traumatic events, and persistent difficulties in sustaining relationship. And those, if you like, are the additional diagnostics that sort of differentiate PTSD and CPTSD. I hope that's making sense. I'm always aware that we're doing a brief fly through of a lot of things here. I absolutely love neuroscience. Trauma in the brain is one of my favourite subjects. I could talk about it for many hours. We don't have many hours to do it, so I'm going to just very quickly make the point that what we know now, and there's a couple of papers, published papers that I'll put on the reading list, we know that there are significant structural changes in the brain in response to repeated traumatic events. So we know that there is dysregulation of the parts of the brain that control the stress response. the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system. We know that the amygdala, which if you like is the alarm bell of the brain, the part that sort of detects threat and danger, becomes hyper-aroused and dysregulated in response to trauma, and therefore there's a sense of danger everywhere sometimes. And we know that the sort of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response as a result of sympathetic activation, and then also the sort of dorsal parasympathetic response that causes the freeze response, cause people to have significant issues with being able to, I guess, find that middle space of feeling safe, feeling regulated, and feeling able to engage in life. And that middle space where they're able to do that becomes quite narrow. And the likelihood of people finding themselves in a state of fight or flight, sort of hyperarousal, or a state of freeze, hypoarousal, is high. So people often find themselves sort of moving between those states, or sometimes more dominantly stuck in one. The fawn response, there's been a little bit of work on. Some of you might be quite familiar with that work, but it's the idea that particularly for women, a trauma response is then to sort of tend and befriend or try to people please, if you like. Other more recent work, and this stuff is really interesting, particularly if you're interested in movement, is the findings around interoceptive disruption as a result of trauma. So the book that was sort of most famously written about this was by a guy called A.D. Budd Craig, and he wrote a book called How Do You Feel? But what he identified that the interoception is disrupted as a result of trauma, and interoception is our ability to feel sensation in our own body. So things like you're feeling your heartbeat is an interoceptive experience. Body awareness of needing the loo or being thirsty, interoceptive experience. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that if your ability to feel inside your body and feel sensation in your body is disrupted, then it becomes very difficult to exist in the world as a person. And as I mentioned, a lot of my work was in self-harm. We can start to see maybe why people would feel the need to self-harm, to be able to have that sense of having a body or being able to feel your body. Interoception is quite strongly associated with activity in the insula, which is a little fold sort of in the front side of the brain. And the great thing, and I'll come on to this later, but the great thing is that we know that yoga and some types of mindful movement can really increase interoception. So that's a little bit of joyful information. We also know that trauma causes disruption to memory. So people often talk about things like flashbacks, re-experiencing of traumatic experience, the part of the brain, the hippocampus, that both controls the downregulation of your stress response and controls memory processing. The thinking is that at the time of a traumatic event, the stress response and overwhelm that happens causes memory to be unprocessed and fragmented, and therefore that memory is never properly integrated, and results in this experience of flashback. And what we also know is that trauma can cause reduction in the sort of medial and prefrontal cortex. And as I say, I don't have time to get really deep into the neuroscience, but we know that what happens is that the medial and prefrontal cortex are the parts of the brain that are most associated with rational thought processing, decision making, logical sequencing, and to some degree interaction with others. And when our experience has been one of repeated trauma, the emotional part of the brain, so structures like the amygdala, I mentioned that earlier, the alarm bell of the brain, the hippocampus, important for downregulating the stress response, they become more dominant, and if you like, they hijack the thinking part of our brain. So we find ourselves in that state of hypervigilance, of feeling afraid and feeling like we're under attack or under threat a lot of the time. And the reason why I tell you this is when you start to understand that the changes in the brain are structural, as well as the rupture and repair of relationships, as well as the lack of trust and sense of safety and the attachment theory. I don't have time to talk about attachment theory today. When you understand that all of that is going on in the experience of somebody who's got CPTSD, then we can start to understand the way that people present, which is often dysregulated, very shut down or hyperaroused, disconnected from their body. and sometimes unable to feel the sense that they have a body. So often in the work that I've done with people who self-harm, the yoga practice that we start off with is one of really just bringing your fingers into your fists and extending your fingers out. I don't know if you can see me or not, but it's sort of really, really small dose as we talk about movement, because coming to big movements and that overwhelming sense of your body in space feels really too much for many people. So we often start really small and work with the idea that a little bit of physical practice can do quite a lot. One of my favourite authors on trauma, and I would actually recommend this over the work of Bessel van der Kolk if I had to, written by a woman, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. I've got the book here, I'll put it up in front of my screen so you can see it. And what Judith Herman wrote about is she was really fundamental in developing the sort of trauma recovery model that's most commonly used. And she said that the core experience of trauma is disempowerment and disconnection from others, and that recovery is based on the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. And that's really fundamental to the work that we do at Edinburgh Community Yoga, empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. And what she also said, and if you take one thing away from today, if you work specifically with people who've experienced trauma, no intervention that takes power away from a survivor can possibly foster their recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in their immediate best interest. And I'll give you a really good example of that in yoga. Those of you who are yoga teachers or who practice yoga might have heard yoga teachers say things like, take some deep belly. I'm actually not that good at it, so I don't do it too much anymore. But if you breathe from your diaphragm and take a long exhale, make your exhale longer than your inhale. This will activate your parasympathetic nervous system and will help you relax. From a scientific perspective, that is true. And for some people, that will be true. If I have held my breath for my whole entire life as a result of sexual trauma in childhood, which is often the way that people respond, if breathing is scary, if to be heard to breathe is frightening, and if in trying not to be seen, you've held your breath for much of your life, a well-intentioned yoga teacher telling you that taking deep belly breaths with a long exhale might actually be completely overwhelming, re-traumatizing for you. And what in the end happens is that the person's sense of not being okay is exacerbated, because even the yoga teacher tells me that this practice should be relaxing and it makes me feel worse. So no intervention that takes power away from a survivor. You're taking power away when you say, I will tell you how to breathe and this is what you should experience. So a different way to do that might be, how might it be to breathe down a little bit in your body? How might it be to lengthen your inhale or your exhale just a little? If that doesn't feel okay for you, you can come back to breathing normally at any point. Those two things encourage the same practice, but they're offered in a very different way, and they're offered with choice and invitation. And so I come back to the statement again and again and again in our work. It is so easy for us to want to throw practices that we believe will fix, in inverted commas, people, and often it can do harm. The idea of empowerment is really the process of gaining freedom and power to do what you want or control over what happens to you. And sadly, I'm going to talk about power dynamics and abuse in yoga. We need to be really careful, because if we want yoga and movement practices to be practices, and I would imagine that we all do, if we want these to be practices that support autonomy and agency and empowerment, then we need to be really careful. My colleague Theo Wildcroft wrote a book called Post-Lineage Yoga. And she wrote in that book, the role of the yoga teacher has so often become telling people how to move, when to breathe, what to feel, and what the results of the practice will be. And then we expect autonomy and self-awareness to arise. Really interesting to reflect on that. And the book, and I know that Andrew had Matthew Remski on the podcast recently. Matthew Remski's book, Practice and All Is Coming. I think he's got a newer title on that book, but that work highlights a lot of the systemic sexual and physical abuse that has happened in the yoga industry, particularly under lineages that are upheld by sort of guru characters where power dynamics have been abused, and they've been abused because of exactly what Theo Wildcroft said above. Cultures have been created where people expect to be told what to do, expect to be told how to move, and that you end up with these unhealthy sort of high demand groups where poor behaviour isn't questioned. And over the last few years, there are countless examples of abuse in the yoga industry. Very recently, um, another sort of highly esteemed Ashtanga teacher who actually runs a not-for-profit supporting addiction recovery has just been called out for abuse of students. And it's really, really important that in the communities that we operate in, we watch out for these unhealthy power dynamics. Our job as movement practitioners, as movement or yoga facilitators, is to reduce the power dynamic as much as we possibly can so that we can support the people that we work with to feel a sense of autonomy. It's really, really important. And it's particularly important when we work with vulnerable groups or marginalised groups where people are used to disempowerment, used to feeling disempowered, and also where attachment, I don't have time to get into talking about attachment theory, but where unhealthy attachment might be the norm. So let's get to the good stuff, having probably made you all feel a bit depressed. Why does yoga, why might movement help? So we know that physical activity increases interoception. The caveat to that is it mostly increases interoception when we draw attention to interoception. So when we make the focus, what do we feel instead of how does it look? And that's really important. And if you take you can take a yoga posture, or you can take a series of movements in the gym with weights. If our focus is on what something looks like and not on how it feels in the body, then the interoceptive sort of potential is lost. And we also are then working with an external focus of success rather than what something feels like. The practice of yoga and the practice of movement, when facilitated in a way that encourages this, is a practice of being in the present moment. When we're thinking about being present in nature, being present in our bodies, being present in the moment, we practice that sense of mental well-being that comes from just small opportunities to be present in the moment instead of ruminating on the past or thinking about the future. We know that the window of tolerance grows when people practice yoga in a trauma-informed way. What I mean by window of tolerance, if you remember earlier on, I talked about the fact that for people with CPTSD, their ability to exist in that place where we feel safe, connected, and able to explore is often very narrow. If I come to my yoga mat for the first time and somebody says, come into chair pose, which is a really strong pose through the legs, Utkatasana, and stay here for 10 breaths and breathe through it and feel the pain and do it. For many people that I work with, and that is way too much. The dose is way too big, and they will very quickly, as they feel the heart rate increase, be tipped over into a state of either hyperarousal or shutdown. If we say, how might it be to stay here for one more breath? What we see is that over time, people start to understand that they can tolerate a little bit of distress, a little bit of strong sensation when they have choice over how long they do that for. Over time, what I've seen is that starts to expand. So the window of tolerance starts to grow. And when the window of tolerance grows on your yoga mat or in an activity class, it also grows out with that in our lives. And we've got lots and lots of evaluation that sort of speaks to that sense that window of tolerance can be expanded, and that really helps people to exist in the world. Boundaried relationships of authenticity are super important. So as somebody who facilitates a trauma-informed yoga space or a trauma-informed movement space, what we're then doing is supporting healthy relationships that do not take advantage of power dynamics, that are compassionate, that meet people where they are, but are also boundaried. And again, I could do a whole session on boundaries, but boundaried relationships of authenticity and mutuality, really important. The sense of community is fundamental to everything that we do. The relationships that are formed. Somebody said it to me recently off the back of a 10-year women's program that I've been running. that unfortunately the funding ceased and the project came to an end. And one of the women said, and I was so glad she said it, she was like, no offense, Lorraine, but you're essentially a worker and you'll come and you'll go when the funding goes, which is exactly what happened. And she said, all these relationships that I've got with all these women will carry on forever. And that's what I want to hear as a teacher. I want to hear that community is the most important part of what people do. The relationships formed with each other continue long after our projects end. Empowerment, choice, and agency. When you offer practices of movement and yoga with a sense of choice and invitation rather than a sense of coercion or command, then we encourage people to start to feel a sense of agency. Ah, maybe I could choose to lift my arm all the way up or just some of the way up. I'll see how I feel. There's a mindful element to, I'm going to say, to lots of movement practices if it is encouraged. And yoga in particular is a mindful practice by its nature. But certainly I would say that, the work that I do at Wildstrong encompasses mindfulness, that type of movement where you're really focused on the present moment with awareness. And then neuroplasticity. I've got a brilliant paper on yoga and the brain. To be honest, I'm not that familiar with the movement work. So outside of yoga, with the sort of gym work, I couldn't quote your research on the sort of neurophysiological impacts, but I'm almost certain that there will be very similar papers on some of that stuff. But we know that the practice of yoga, we know in fact that finely tuned, planned, coordinated movement conducted in an enriched environment contributes to neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change. And that's really important because if you remember what I said earlier, that complex post-traumatic stress disorder causes structural changes in the brain. We know that some of these practices that we work with can create shifts in the shape and size of those structures and in the way that they function. That means that some of the symptoms of CPTSD can be reduced. So in terms of trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed practice has been around since the 90s. It is not specific to yoga, maybe even before the 90s, maybe even earlier than that. I'll check. But the core principles, and some of you will be familiar with this, sort of trauma-informed education was where this started, and then healthcare. Some of you may work in the NHS and have done the many, many TURAS modules on trauma-informed practice, but the core principles are safety, choice, collaboration, empowerment, and trust. And all of the work that we do in offering trauma-informed yoga programming works with those principles of trauma-informed practice. In terms of putting them into practice, and hopefully these are skills that we can take and apply to any of our movement spaces that we operate in. So non-coercion, so working to reduce the power dynamic, and I've touched on that already. Instead of, I want you to do this, I know what's best for you, I am telling you to do this, encourage autonomy. There will always be a power dynamic between somebody who is facilitating a space and somebody who is attending, and particularly somebody who might be paying or receiving for free access to that space. The power dynamic does exist, so I really don't like it when I hear people say, oh, there is no power dynamic. There's always a power dynamic. But what we want to do is actively try to discourage unhealthy power dynamics whenever we can, and also to question them when we see them. So when we see people saying, do this, do that. And in yoga, there's many, many examples of this. It's really important that we always ask questions and that we always encourage and explicitly encourage people to question us. Encouraging interoception instead of what things look like. And you might do that by saying things like, notice how this feels. Perhaps you can be curious about sensation in your body. Instead of saying some of them, I don't know that there's too much of this stuff out there now, but instead of saying some of the common phrases that we hear around exercise and sport of push through pain or this should hurt or no pain, no gain is the other one. Encouraging people to be curious and sensitive about what sensation feels like in their body is really important. And that encourages that interoceptive part that we talked about being reduced in the experience of trauma. Making choice. We can never offer enough choice. And I want to be really clear. I might have a slide on this later, actually, but one of the big challenges that people present me, or one of the questions that people present me with when I do this kind of conversation or have this kind of conversation is, but then you're just, trauma-informed practice isn't giving people any sort of structure. and you're just saying do what you want. We are not saying that in working in a trauma-informed way, we're just saying do an interpretive dance and move in whatever way you want. We're offering choice in a boundaried and structured way. And that might be by saying you could have your eyes open or closed. And it is a myth that people who have experienced trauma should never close their eyes. Trauma-informed trainings are running the risk of also becoming a little bit dogmatic. Choice is the most important thing. You can have your eyes open or closed. It's your choice. You might choose to lift your arm some of the way up, or maybe you can reach it all the way up alongside your ear. Words like maybe, choose, you could are very different. To do this, move now, and some of the language that I shared from Theo earlier, telling people how to move and what they should feel. Choice in the physical space, and all of you will work in different types of environments, but thinking about letting people have a choice as to where they situate themselves in a room. And a really, really important part, and this is probably one of my key learnings over the last 10 years, be as predictable and as consistent as you can. So for example, as a yoga teacher with many of the groups that I work with, I need to give people 6 weeks notice to let them know that I'm going to be off and that I would have a cover teacher coming in, let people know who that cover teacher is going to be. In an ideal situation, let them meet the cover teacher in advance. And I know that's not always possible, but trying to create as much predictability and consistency as possible, because people who have experienced repeated traumatic experience have often lived without predictability and consistency. So being consistent, being predictable, and being explicit. So I would always say at the beginning of a class, I would always name any sounds that I'm expecting. So in one of my classes, I would always say, there's a bottle bank in the background. At some point, it will be emptied and it will make a really loud noise so that people know that that's coming. Touch, again, we could have a whole conversation about the use of touch. Consent and touch goes further than saying, do you want an adjustment today? Because most people will say yes or won't have the confidence to say no. We need to either decide. So in my work, because of the type of work that I do, we never, not never, but we hardly ever work with touch. And I will always actively say at the beginning of a class, I will not be putting my hands on anybody during this class. If you do work with touch, you need to make sure that there are proper conversations about consent and that they happen every single time. So just because somebody said 1 week that they're happy for a physical adjustment, that may not be the case the next time. And I also think as teachers, it's really important that we question ourselves about why we want to use touch and whether there's a different way that we can offer the opportunity for people to make an adjustment to their physical posture without putting our hands on them. So sometimes in my outreach classes, I'll notice that somebody, I don't know if you can see me, but their hand will be all scrumpled up and their arm will be all crumpled up. I could go and take their arm and stretch it out for them. That's not what I do. I could say, hey, Johnny, your arm's all scrumpled up, stretch it out. But that brings attention to that person and might make them feel uncomfortable. And so what I might say is, maybe to the whole group, maybe you can try making space between your fingers and seeing if you can stretch your arm out as far as you can. And what my experience is that normally people will start to develop more of a sense of awareness of their body and how they move just by offering verbal cues. I hope that gives you just a little bit of a sense that the idea of shared authentic experience is the next principle, really, really important. So we need to be really careful in how we use, I always call them adjectives. My English grammar is not that good, but I think they are adjectives. So describing words. So the point that I'm getting here is that non-assumption of relationship is really, really, non-assumption of experience is really, really important when we do this work. So not saying things like this lovely, yummy posture will be really relaxing. We don't actually know that. I work with people where particular postures remind them of situations in which they were abused. So I never make an assumption about how a posture will feel in somebody's body. I might say something like, I feel a little bit stretching on my side here, you might feel the same. And that's the shared authentic experience rather than the assumption of experience. And then individual language, sorry, somebody's knocking on my door. Invitational language, so thinking about offering A, B or ABC choices. So, and flipping the hierarchy. And in yoga, we've been really poor at this over the years. We say things like, if you can't do the full expression of the posture, do something else. And when we talk about flipping the hierarchy, what we're talking about is you might try keeping one foot on the floor, but putting a little bit of weight into your other foot to explore balance. And if that feels okay, you could try taking your foot off the ground. And that's giving an A-B choice to somebody as to how they explore movement without giving them the idea that there's a sort of unattainable end goal. And if they can't do that, then we'll give them an easy option, if you like. I'm super conscious of time. Just before I finish up, things to watch out for and things to watch out for when we talk about trauma, when we talk about working with people with trauma. Please stay away from the language, "this is a safe space." I hear it all the time. This is a safe space. As soon as I hear that language, I immediately don't feel that safe. And the reason is that we don't know what people need to feel safe. So you can change that language to say something like, "we aim to create as much safety as possible. If there's anything you need specifically, you could let us know at the beginning of the class." That expression, "this is a safe space," sort of assumes experience. Sorry about that. Be really careful about trauma therapy speak. So trauma-informed practice is absolutely not trauma therapy. I am not a trauma therapist. My aim is never to help somebody cure, in inverted commas, their trauma. My aim is to create a space for people to explore movement in a way that feels a little bit more safe and a little bit more accessible for them. We're never going to create a trigger-free environment, so again, avoid that language. And if you go on to do further training in trauma-informed practice, there are specific things that we can do to try to eliminate triggers. Talking to students and having a plan, if you're working specifically with groups of people with CPTSD, is always useful. And the last point I think I've made already. I've talked about that already. This is just a little quote. You'll see that in the slides when they come round. It's just another quote from our participants. And I guess my take-home messages would be for all of you in whatever work you do to get really clear on being confident in questioning and challenging unhealthy power dynamics in your communities or the fields of work that you find yourself in. Ask yourself the question, who are you missing? So I think that's a great question in terms of thinking about how you can make the practices that you work with more accessible. Who's not here? Who are we not seeing? And what groups might you be able to tap into? What communities that already exist might you be able to tap into to offer the work that you do with? Being authentic in that is really, really important. And I always say this to the yoga teachers that we train is, don't go and teach in a prison if you're not comfortable working in a prison. I am a bit awkward. I am not comfortable teaching in traditional yoga teaching, yoga studio environments. I am comfortable working in a prison. I don't know why that is. I've never been in prison, but that's where I'm comfortable. So being authentic to and true to yourself is really important. Partnership working is really essential if you want to work with traumatised groups. I would never recommend that anybody sets up a public-facing class that says trauma-informed exercise, come along if you have CPTSD. You open yourself up to being really unsupported and putting yourself and students in dangerous situations. So I think you can incorporate, and I really hope that you can all go away today and incorporate some of what we've talked about into the work that you do, without having to specifically target, or target's not really a good word, but specifically work with those groups. If you do want to, then partnership working is absolutely key. Knowing your scope of practice, so being really key. I'm always very, very clear. I'm not a talking therapist. I'm not a physiotherapist. I'm not a yoga therapist. And I would never seek to do any harm by trying to give people advice or therapy that I'm not qualified or trained to do. And my final point, and I think this is really important in the context of the communities that we find ourselves in and the current economic and political situation, is that we have to keep the faith that our power lies in our communities and in the community mobilisation that we can do with the work that we do. And, I'm not here for a minute to say that yoga is going to solve the problems of, I think it's a very sort of neoliberal responsibilization type of discourse when we start to say that individuals have to make the change. When we live in a society where people don't have adequate housing and can't feed their families, yoga is not going to change the world. But I do know that the work that we do empowers people, and I hope that in that empowerment, change within communities can be encouraged and supported. there's a little, I'll maybe just put this call to action up at the end. If you're interested in joining our 2026 training dates, you can click on the QR codes here. You can sign up to our newsletter, and we will be in touch with dates. Well, I just leave that up just now, Andrew. I sort of wanted to come back to see everybody's faces. I haven't really left a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to stick around and we can hopefully have a little bit of a discussion. Thank you very much. Stop share.
Uh, Thanks, Lorraine. That was really good. I took loads of notes. I tried to keep up with the books that you posted, so I think as much as I was able to, I think I did, yes. And then the updated title is Surviving Modern Yoga, I think, or the maybe slightly different edition. But I think I got pretty much all of those, and I wasn't sure if I found the right paper, but I know a lot of people be interested in that neuroplasticity and yoga paper. So I'm curious about that. We do have a few questions. And if anyone wants to go off mute, you're more than welcome to. I'll go ahead and just sort of read the questions as they came in.
Thank
Um,
you. I'm sorry for going over. I was trying to
Oh,
go around.
that's okay. Oh yeah, so well, you're not over yet. Don't worry. So we're just at 29 past. So if anyone does need to leave, we can keep I don't actually I don't know if we keep the Q&A in the recording or not. We might take it off for privacy. I'll double check with Jill. It's recording now and I can't remember if we edit out or not. But anyway, we'll get in some questions. If you need to leave, that's no worry. But the first one was from Emma and she had I thought she had a good comment and then also a follow-up question. She said, I've started saying, how do you feel about touch or assist rather than are you okay with touch? It allows for more dialogue and we can work in a collaboration together, which I thought was a nice way. And then she also said, happy to hear anyone else's ideas, phrases they find work as well. So I thought that was a nice one to open up your thoughts, Lorraine, and if anyone else has thought about this as well.
Absolutely. And I think in the first instance, it just moves you away from that yes or no response. Like, yes, I want an adjustment, or no, I don't. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with yoga adjustments, but the dialogue is really critical. What I would also say is that as you build a relationship with people over time, and once you've established a sense of safety and trust, or a little bit more safety and a little bit more trust, then it gives you more space to start to open up the conversation about adjustments. Um, and I will always, in the groups that I work with, just because of the nature of my work, I always say at the beginning, I won't be doing any hands-on adjustments. But if I was to move into giving adjustments, and again, it's the power dynamic, isn't it? I will give you an adjustment. Um, is how we navigate that conversation. So how do you feel about having a hands-on assist? Or how do you feel about the fact that, I might put my hands on my back and see if it gives you a little bit more of a sense of stretching down the backs of your hamstrings? That is very different language to what we often hear, particularly in yoga, which is, I'm going to come along and give you a lovely squish. And that sort of language assumes experience.
Hmm.
And actually, we have no idea how somebody's going to receive that adjustment. So yeah, Emma, I think that's brilliant. And thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you were saying about the sort of hierarchy of sometimes just the way we present different movement as saying, well, ultimately this is what everybody should be doing, and if you can't be doing it, we don't want to put people in a position where they feel like somehow they've failed, and it's one of the things I think a lot about in running group classes and personal training as well. Sometimes in a group class, they might say, in an attempt to be inclusive, they might say, is anybody not okay with this, or is anyone who doesn't think they can do this? And it's sort of that same thing in one's attempt to sort of open up options. It puts people in a spot where most people are going to default, especially with the yes no question, to kind of whatever the path of least resistance is in some ways and not wanting to rock the boat too much.
What I always tend to do is just start with the simplest option and then say, if you'd like to add a bit on, then you might try this. And then
Yeah.
what you've got is the people, there might be a few people who try that, but it feels like that's an add-on or a nice to have rather than the expectation of where we're at.
Yeah. I like the language of invitation that you used as well. It was sort of like low pressure, like, you might do this, you could
Yeah.
try that.
Yeah.
Um, does anyone else, any other comments on talking about manual adjustments or phrasing questions and things like that, or I can move on to the next question. Um, okay. Alex,
Yeah, sorry, go on. Andrew, you keep going. I won't.
okay, cool. Alex had a question. She said, I want to ask about what are some of the tenets of safety other than predictability and empowerment. And I also want to know that as well. So I think that's really interesting about, yeah, just sort of, well, I'll let you talk because you've got the better language. I do.
So I think for predictability and being explicit in the space about what's going to happen is really key. That's one of the key things. Beginning to start to encourage a sense of safety in one's own body is really important, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that that can be very, very difficult for people. So if I come back to the example of breath, sometimes we hear yoga teachers saying, breathing is a safe space. Put your hands on your body and breathe deeply, and that you will feel safe. And as I mentioned earlier, breath work can actually be very triggering or very overwhelming for people. What we work with in yoga is grounding practices. Feel your feet on the ground. Maybe you march a little bit, maybe you go from one foot to the other. Um, Maybe you can feel your hands on the ground, press your hands into the floor. So the idea of grounding, of present moment experiences that encourage people to have some sort of tangible sense of the now can be really, really helpful in creating safety. The relationship element is really important. And I think, to be honest, a lot of that is wrapped up in being explicit in the way that you um, give information. So I'll give you an example. When I used to run a program for women in addiction recovery, and I worked with them for about 3 years, and then I got a traveling fellowship to go and explore yoga not for profit internationally. And at the same time, we got a grant to keep that program going. I'd known those women for 2 years. I came back from my 3 months abroad, and one of them said to me, "Hey, everybody's saying that you stole the grant and went traveling, and that's that you stole our grant and you went traveling, and that's where you've been. I don't think you'd do that, but that's what everybody's saying." So that sense of safety after all those years of work, the trust, the fundamental experience that people have had in life is one of mistrust and one of being let down. Um, and I learned from that that actually I needed to be so explicit before I went away. This is where this money's come from. Our grant is still here. This project will resume when I come back. And I've got millions of examples of that that have made that I've realized that you just can never, ever, ever overemphasize being really clear. The other thing that creates safety is offering the same thing to all people. And that's something else that we've learned over the years. If in a group I say to somebody, "Oh, here, you can have a yoga mat," it then creates a sense of people feeling like they're being treated differently, singled out. And unfortunately, particularly in the context of sexual abuse, that is often what has happened to people. So that singling out can make people feel special, but can create a lot of instability. But also for other people in the group, they then feel like, well, why are they being offered that? And people are often hyper attuned. The people I work with are often hyper attuned to that sense of being treated differently. So if you offer something to one person, offer it to everybody and make sure you're able to do that. Doing what you say you will, I think is we're all human beings, we all make mistakes, but it's really easy to say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll send you an email about that," and then forget to do it. So, showing up when you say you will, following through on what you say you'll do, I think all of those things contribute to safety. So I guess it's multifaceted. There's safety in the body and slowly building a sense of safety in the body. There can be safety and connection in the group. And then also between the person facilitating the class and the person. Does that answer your question, Alex? It's quite a big one, but
I suppose I kind of have a follow-up to question to that question, which is like how then to deal with rapture, which is a kind of one of the examples you've given.
yeah. So rupture, there's a number of ways that that can happen. So individually, things can go wrong, right? Where people feel that the relationship is ruptured, but also endings are a really important thing. So creating as much space for conversation about endings as we can, being boundaried is a really important part of reducing the risk of that rupture when we work in a way that is boundaried but compassionate. Um, but it does happen, and I think in my learning, and I don't always get it right. There, I definitely have got it wrong. But dealing with issues quickly when they arise, being honest and upfront, and sort of not falling into that people-pleasing place of over-promising and then not being able to deliver. I'm seeing just some of the chat come in. Just feel free to email me. I'll pop my email address in the chat. I see some people saying this has been quite useful or there's interesting connections. I'm always really happy, and I'm sure Andrew is as well, to hear from anybody. Um, yeah, Alex, I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think we could probably talk about all of that for a while.
I don't know if this is interesting to anybody, but I've been meaning to get Lorraine on the podcast as well. So, if anyone has any questions and you feel like you didn't have time to ask them, you can send them over to us and we'll be sure to incorporate. Well, assuming you say yes, I think you said you're okay with it. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But if we can
Where's
get
my
Lorraine
chat?
on an episode, then we can incorporate some questions if people wanted to ask more. There's yeah, there were some other questions, Lorraine, but I think we can get them later. Me and a few other people expressed interest in learning more about the theory of change.
Yeah,
Um, but that might be outside the remit of the time we have left.
I've got time. I don't, if, I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
anybody's welcome to
Yeah,
stay on.
well, so I have time as well. So if anyone wants to stick around, the slide with the sort of flow chart I thought was very interesting, and you don't need to go into the full detail, but it would be really interesting to know what the theory of change was.
Let me
Um,
pull that slide up. If it's useful
sure.
to look at it together, I'm happy to do that. This was work, to be honest, that we did with Kate. And so Kate is our third director at Edinburgh Community Yoga. I did not know what a theory of change was until about 6 years ago. And Kate does this work. She does it beautifully. She really supported us in developing our theory of change. We have this written in long form and short form on our website as well, in a more sort of textual format. But really what we've got here is essentially the resources that we have on the left. Can you see that? Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, so the places that our money came from, and as I said, this is actually, to be very honest, a failing model at the moment because we're not making any money. So grants and donation is where most of our funding comes from, but inputs come in here. We've got flexible income streams that come from all of the above. Those let us deliver these outreach programs that you see up here in a variety of ways that we do. That sort of input process outcome goal is what you're seeing on here. So these are the inputs. The goal is to work to reduce social isolation, improve social inclusion, support mental and physical health, and reduce health inequality. And then what we've got in the middle here, and I think this is probably where it gets a little bit complicated, but what we want is that through our yoga teacher training, and to be honest, our dream in the last couple of years was to offer a fully accessible, fully funded, trauma-informed yoga teacher training. But the challenge for many, many of our students on outreach programs is that the leap from being on a yoga outreach program, maybe even doing some public yoga classes, to being able to do the level of work that's required in most structured yoga teacher trainings is huge, and the investment required for us to run that teacher training has just not been possible for us to manage to do it. But what we have done is scholarship several teachers on yoga teacher training programs that we believe in and that we trust, and we've worked very, very closely with them to make sure that those students are mentored and supported by Edinburgh Community Yoga while they embark on a yoga teacher training program. And then the idea is that, you know, through that, so there, I guess there's two options. We know that only very, very few outreach students will want to progress with yoga teacher training, and that's okay. You know, we're not really about being attached to outcome. Many, many people, and one of the best bits of advice I ever got from a student at the Royal Ed, which is the psychiatric hospital in Edinburgh, was it's 1 hour a week where I feel a little bit better, and that is enough. So many students will be down here. They'll just feel that they've got improved life skills, a little bit of better mental and physical well-being. Some of them might go on to develop learning that's a sort of prerequisite to yoga teacher training. So we ran twice a 6-month program called the Action Scholarship Program that started to explore yoga philosophy, explore lots of different aspects of skills and assertiveness. And that's able to help people to develop life skills. And I guess our ultimate hope is that those skills then feed into, which is what the green arrows are about, our pool of skilled yoga teachers that are then able to go out and deliver our work and deliver more of it in more communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's I mean for me it's very helpful to see that laid out and see kind of the thought that
Yeah.
went into it. Especially as someone who's pretty chaotic. I don't think I've ever done a theory of change plan in
To
my
be
life.
honest, what it actually looks like is a big scribble, but that was the
Yeah.
best that we
But
could
still,
do.
it's nice to kind of have that sort of platonic ideal of how it could work. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so if anyone does want to go again, but I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to ask a question. I was just thinking about you spoke, I think, very eloquently on the importance of language. And you mentioned a few things, and I just would kind of like for you to expand on that a little bit more. Um, One of them is, you did talk a little bit about, using therapy speak and therapy language. And I thought that was interesting to hear a little bit more about how you sort of talk, or sometimes how do you incorporate the theory of what you talk about without bombarding people with it? Because I think sometimes people can feel like they need to use sort of a specialized language that can almost feel class exclusive. I think a lot of times when people hear certain kinds of language, they could feel like it's above their head or it's not for them, or they feel excluded even though it's meant to be inclusive. Um, that was one, and also, you sort of mentioned it a little bit already, but in the same theme is, kind of internally using the idea of being trauma informed, but then you said that sort of openly using the language of, well, we're trauma informed practice, especially public facing, that can cause some issues as well. So I was wondering if you could just, if not specifically any of those points, if you can kind of talk more on that theme.
Yeah, of course. The first point I could talk about a lot, and I guess there's two elements to this. So one is that from my perspective, trauma-informed practice is never about withholding practices from people. So some of you will know the practice of yoga, and it's a bit about not sort of misappropriating yoga as well. The practice of yoga is way more than just moving and breathing. But if I walk into a space, an outreach space, and I start talking in Sanskrit, talking about yoga philosophical concepts, I will immediately lose my audience because of exactly what you just said. People don't know what I'm talking about. They feel intimidated. And the same is true of scientific language. If I start spraffing about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. However, trusting the practice, so I know that the practice of yoga just does its job, and people actually start to express back to us the benefits that they're feeling, and that gives a window of opportunity to talk about why that might be. And also, if anybody's ever curious, so sometimes I might say something like, the word in yoga, the language of yoga, the language that's associated with yoga is Sanskrit, and the word in Sanskrit for yoga postures is asana. And therefore, you'll notice that if I tell you the word of a posture, the Sanskrit word for a posture, it will always end in asana because that's the word for posture. And people are like, oh, that's really cool. So what does this bit mean? So it's inviting space for exploration without assuming prior knowledge. Um, and that's the same when we talk about, for example, if I'm talking about breath work and I say, you might try making your inhale and your exhale a little longer and a little deeper. Maybe you could make your exhale a tiny bit longer than your inhale. That's not the same as saying take a really long exhale into your belly. Some people find that that long exhale activates the part of your nervous system that can help relaxation. That might not be the case for you, and that's okay. So you're sort of giving people the opportunity to learn. The other thing is that I'm very clear that the work that we do is of a time and a place, and that there are people who may want to go and progress their yoga journey, and there are a million ways to do that. And we'll support people to do that in a way that is as safe as possible. Um, but unfortunately, what we can't account for is what happens once people leave that space. But we also have to trust that people with their own autonomy and their own sense of agency, that it's not my job to protect people forever. We have to support them to go and explore and learn. And one of my students, a girl who's now one of our teachers, an incredible human being, um, always says, I've got my trauma-informed tools inside my body and I know them. So she had an experience where she went to a public class and the teacher was doing handstands and essentially had the whole class just watching her doing handstands, and approached the student and said, oh, is this your first time doing yoga? And she said, no, actually, I've been practicing for 3 years. And this teacher said, oh, you must be from the community classes. And she was saying, had I not had the experience of working with ECY, I wouldn't have felt empowered to be able to be in that space.
Hmm.
The other thing that's really important, and I'm probably speaking to a converted audience, but I am deeply concerned, and Andrew and I have talked about this a little bit in the context of other stuff, but I am deeply concerned about the lack of regulation around trauma therapy, and some of the somatic work that's happening out in the field with people claiming to, in inverted commas, being able to heal trauma. Um, there's a really big difference between some of the work that's happened traditionally in yoga groups and spaces where we can talk about life challenges that we've all experienced. Some of I don't really want to get into little T and big T trauma. It's not language that I love, but where we can say, I've always struggled with feeling uncomfortable in groups. And some of those conversations pop up in yoga spaces, and I sort of get it. It is very, very different when you have been systematically sexually, verbally, or emotionally abused through your life, and how that manifests in your body with CPTSD really causes significant disruption to people's lives. And as therapists, often without, so yoga therapy, often without some of the psychotherapy training or psychology understanding. I'm getting a little bit, I'm in danger of getting into a rant. Some of the work around nervous system regulation and polyvagal theory, for example, where therapists have the idea that if they can take people through different states of nervous system activation, they will heal their trauma, for me are profoundly dangerous. And that's why I don't work with them. Or not even that I don't work with them, but it's why I don't teach them. And I guess I just want to be really clear that working in a trauma-informed way is not working in a trauma therapeutic way.
I think that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
And then you had another bit. What was the second part of your
Actually,
question?
I think you did a good job of answering it in the first one. All right. Lorraine, thanks so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. I got a lot out of it, and I know a lot of other people did as well from the comments. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who attended. We'll send out a follow-up that will have the recordings and any other links. And feel free to get in touch with us. Lorraine said she shared her email already, but we can go ahead and put her email in the follow-up email as well if you want to contact her. And if you do have any questions, if you don't want to ask directly or anything like that, just let me know and we can work it into the interview conversation that hopefully we'll have within the next month or so. Oh, and Lorraine's gone ahead and shared that. So, thank you much. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to go ahead
Thank
and
you
end
so
this.
much, everybody.
A
Yeah,
lot.
really appreciate your time, and just send me any ideas, thoughts. I'm really happy to hear from you.